In the darkness of the early morning hours on the 10th day of September in 1944, the waters of the South China Sea lay calm and deceptively peaceful beneath a clear tropical sky. The moon had set hours earlier, and the stars provided only the faintest illumination across the vast expanse of ocean. Aboard the bridge of the Japanese cruiser Ioba, a man named Tezo Matsunaga stood at his post, his hands resting on the cold metal railing as he surveyed the darkness ahead. Matsunaga held the rank of Admiral in the Imperial Japanese Navy, and on this night he commanded a task force of considerable size, a collection of warships and merchant vessels steaming steadily westward toward the Philippine Islands. The rhythmic thrumming of the ship's engines created a constant background noise, a mechanical heartbeat that had become so familiar over the days at sea that Matsunaga barely registered it anymore. The night seemed routine, even peaceful, and nothing in the Admiral's experience suggested that the coming minutes would fundamentally alter his understanding of the war his nation was fighting. Around him on the bridge, staff officers moved about their duties with practiced efficiency. These men had served together for months, some for years, and they had developed the easy confidence that comes from shared experience and professional competence. When Matsunaga had inquired earlier in the evening about the threat of enemy submarines, his subordinates had reassured him with the conventional wisdom that had dominated Japanese naval thinking since the beginning of the war. American submarines, they told him, operated primarily in the waters near Hawaii or off the coast of Australia. The Pacific Ocean was simply too vast, too incomprehensibly enormous, for the enemy to patrol effectively. The Imperial Navy's strategic thinkers had calculated that the Americans lacked both the numbers and the capability to threaten Japanese shipping across the breadth of the ocean. It was a comfortable assumption, one that allowed commanders like Matsunaga to focus their attention on what they considered the real threats, the American carrier groups and the possibility of surface engagements with enemy battleships. Then, without warning, the night exploded into chaos. The first torpedo struck the cruiser Miyoko, one of the vessels under Matsunaga's command, slamming into her stern with devastating force. The explosion was enormous, a brilliant flash of orange and white fire that momentarily turned night into day. The blast lifted the rear portion of the cruiser entirely out of the water, and a massive geyser of seawater mixed with burning fuel oil erupted skyward. The concussion from the explosion rolled across the water, reaching the Ioba seconds later as a physical shock that Matsunaga felt in his chest. Before anyone on the bridge could fully process what had happened, before orders could be given or evasive maneuvers initiated, another torpedo found its mark. This time the target was the Kachidoki Maru, a tanker laden with fuel, and when the warhead detonated against her hull, the resulting explosion was even more catastrophic. The tanker's cargo ignited, transforming the vessel into a floating inferno that lit up the night for miles in every direction. Matsunaga gripped the bridge railing with both hands, his knuckles white with tension, as his mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. The attacks continued. Another torpedo struck the destroyer Shikanami, and the smaller warship shuddered under the impact, her structure groaning as seawater flooded into her compartments. The Admiral's carefully organized convoy was dissolving into pandemonium around him. Ships were breaking formation, turning sharply to avoid unseen threats, their wakes creating confused patterns on the dark water. Alarm bells rang across the task force. Lookouts screamed warnings into voice tubes. Gun crews scrambled to their stations, though they had no target to shoot at, no visible enemy to engage. The questions that filled Matsunaga's mind were fundamental and terrifying. How could the Americans be here, thousands of miles from their bases, operating in the middle of the ocean in the absolute darkness of night? His understanding of the war, his assumptions about American capabilities, his confidence in Japanese naval superiority, all of it was crumbling in the span of minutes. The answer to his questions came in the form of yet another attack. Lookouts on the Ioba, their eyes now adjusted to the darkness and frantically scanning the water, spotted the telltale white wake of another torpedo cutting through the Black Sea, heading directly toward the flagship. The wake was phosphorescent, glowing faintly as the torpedo's propellers churned through water filled with bioluminescent organisms. Matsunaga watched the track of the weapon approaching his ship, and in that moment he understood with absolute clarity that the Americans were not concentrated in one region or confined to certain patrol zones. They were everywhere. The ocean that Japan had considered her protective moat, the vast Pacific that was supposed to be her strategic advantage, had become a hunting ground where American submarines operated with apparent impunity. When the war had begun nearly 3 years earlier, officers throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy had held deeply dismissive views about the role of submarines in modern naval warfare. The prevailing doctrine emphasized aircraft carriers and battleships as the decisive weapons, the platforms that would determine the outcome of major fleet engagements. Submarines were regarded as auxiliary vessels, useful perhaps for reconnaissance or for harassing enemy shipping in limited areas, but fundamentally secondary to the great surface vessels that commanded everyone's attention and respect. Japanese naval planners devoted their resources and their thinking to preparing for the climactic battle they expected would come, the great confrontation between opposing fleets that would decide control of the Pacific. In this vision of naval warfare, submarines played only a supporting role, picking off damaged ships or gathering intelligence, but never serving as a primary instrument of victory. The bitter irony of this miscalculation would become apparent only gradually as the months and years of war unfolded. The American submarine force at the beginning of the war constituted merely 6% of the United States Navy, a small fraction of the overall fleet. Yet this relatively modest force would ultimately sink more than half of Japan's merchant shipping fleet and destroy 1/3 of her warships. The submarine force would send 8 aircraft carriers to the bottom, an achievement that seemed impossible given that carriers were supposed to be the dominant weapon of the Pacific War. They would sink the mighty battleship Congo, one of Japan's most powerful capital ships, a vessel that symbolized the surface fleet doctrine that Japanese admirals cherished. By the time the year 1945 arrived and the war ground toward its inevitable conclusion, senior officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy had come to realize with devastating clarity that submarines had strangled their empire as effectively as any strategic bombing campaign, perhaps even more effectively. The shock that Japanese commanders experienced did not come from any single dramatic battle or decisive engagement. There was no submarine equivalent of Midway, no climactic moment when the tide visibly turned. Instead, the impact came from the relentless, grinding, never-ending nature of the submarine campaign. Japan had entered the war in December of 1941 with a merchant fleet totaling approximately 6 million tons of shipping. These vessels formed the lifelines of the empire. They carried crude oil from the refineries of the Dutch East Indies, transported rubber from the plantations of Malaya, brought rice from the fields of Burma, and moved countless other resources and supplies that the Japanese home islands desperately needed. Japan's industry depended on imported raw materials. Her cities required imported food. Her military forces scattered across the Pacific, and Asia needed a constant flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and fuel. All of this depended on maintaining secure sea lanes across thousands of miles of ocean. As the submarine campaign intensified, those sea lanes became increasingly hazardous, then dangerous, then nearly suicidal. The merchant fleet that had seemed so substantial in 1941 began to shrink. At first, the losses were manageable, painful, but not catastrophic. Shipyards could replace some of the sunken tonnage. Convoys could be organized and routed to avoid known danger areas. But as American submarines grew more numerous and more effective, as their crews gained experience and their commanders developed better tactics, the rate of sinkings accelerated. The mathematics of attrition began to work inexorably against Japan. Ships were going to the bottom faster than new vessels could be launched. The merchant fleet, which needed to grow to support Japan's expanding territorial empire, was instead contracting month by month. Like a python slowly tightening around its prey, the submarine blockade was suffocating the Japanese war effort. The mathematical reality behind this slow strangulation was genuinely staggering when examined in detail. At the peak of American submarine operations, the United States Navy operated fewer than 300 submarines in the Pacific Theater. This was not an enormous force in absolute terms. 300 vessels spread across the largest ocean on Earth might seem impossibly thin, unable to create any meaningful barrier to enemy shipping. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles. How could such a small number of submarines possibly patrol such an enormous area effectively? Yet through a combination of improved tactics, technological advantages, better intelligence, and submarines specifically designed for long-range operations, the American submarine force made the vast Pacific feel surprisingly small. Japanese merchant captains, who should have been able to simply navigate around patrol areas, found themselves under attack in places they had considered safe. Submarines appeared hundreds of miles from where Japanese intelligence expected them to be. The ocean's immensity, which should have protected Japanese shipping, instead became irrelevant. By the year 1944, a year before the war would end, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels at a rate faster than Japanese shipyards could possibly replace them. The imbalance had become catastrophic. In the year 1943 alone, American submarines destroyed approximately 1.5 million tons of shipping. That figure represented thousands of individual vessels, each one carrying cargo that would never reach its destination, each sinking representing lost resources, lost lives, and another severed connection in the network of supply lines that held Japan's empire together. But if 1943 had been devastating, 1944 was apocalyptic. The number of tons sunk rose to nearly 3 million, double the previous year's total. Japan's shipbuilding capacity, already strained by the demands of building and maintaining naval warships, could not begin to replace even a fraction of the lost merchant tonnage. The empire's economy began to contract as imports dried up. Industries shut down for lack of raw materials. Stockpiles of essential goods dwindled and disappeared. One aspect of this campaign that remains lesser known, even among students of military history, involves the problems that plagued American submarines early in the war. When the United States entered the conflict in December of 1941, the submarine force possessed what appeared on paper to be an excellent weapon, the Mark 14 torpedo. This torpedo had been developed during the 1930s, and its designers believed they had created a sophisticated and effective weapon. The Mark 14 used a magnetic influence exploder that was supposed to detonate the warhead when it passed beneath the keel of a target ship, breaking the vessel's back with the force of the underwater explosion. In theory, this was far more effective than hitting the side of a ship's hull. In practice, the Mark 14 torpedo was plagued by multiple serious defects that rendered it nearly useless during the first 18 months of the war. Submarine commanders reported again and again that their torpedoes ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath their targets rather than exploding under the keel as intended. Even when torpedoes appeared to strike their targets directly, they frequently failed to explode at all. Other times they detonated prematurely, exploding well short of the target and alerting the enemy to the submarine's presence without inflicting any damage. Submarine captains, highly trained professionals who had positioned their boats perfectly and fired their weapons at point-blank range, watched in frustration and disbelief as their torpedoes malfunctioned. Some skippers fired entire salvos, 6 or 8 torpedoes, at stationary targets and achieved no hits. The psychological toll on submarine crews was immense. They had risked their lives to get into firing position, had executed their attacks flawlessly, and had nothing to show for it except wasted torpedoes and growing doubts about their equipment. Japanese officers, observing the American submarine attacks during this period, actually mocked what they called the dud fish. They noticed that American submarines seemed to have trouble sinking their targets, that many attacks resulted in no damage at all. This observation fed into the existing Japanese assumption that American submarines were ineffective and could be safely disregarded as a serious threat. But the mockery would prove short-lived. American naval ordnance experts, initially resistant to accepting that their carefully designed torpedoes were faulty, eventually conducted systematic tests that revealed the multiple problems with the Mark 14. The depth-keeping mechanism was flawed. The magnetic exploder was too sensitive, sometimes detonating from the Earth's magnetic field rather than a ship's magnetic signature. The contact exploder, which should have worked when the magnetic exploder failed, had its own problems related to the firing pin mechanism. Once these defects were finally acknowledged and corrected in 1943, the impact was immediate and utterly catastrophic for Japanese shipping. Submarine sinkings, which had been disappointingly low despite numerous attacks, suddenly doubled in that single year. American submarine commanders, who had been filing frustrated patrol reports describing failed attacks, now began sending messages describing spectacular successes. Convoys that had previously escaped with minimal damage were now devastated. Tankers carrying precious fuel oil exploded and sank. Transport ships crowded with soldiers and supplies went down with heavy loss of life. The Japanese officers who had laughed at the dud fish stopped laughing. By 1944, those same officers dreaded every voyage across open water, knowing that somewhere beneath the waves, an unseen hunter might be waiting with torpedoes that now worked with deadly reliability. Technology played an enormous role in the success of the American submarine campaign, and perhaps no single piece of technology was more important than the radar set designated as the SJ. American submarines carried this radar equipment, which gave them a capability that Japanese forces almost entirely lacked. The SJ radar could detect ships on the surface at night from a distance of 10 miles or more. This meant that an American submarine could operate on the surface under the cover of darkness, using its radar to track enemy convoys without ever making visual contact. The submarine commander could see the enemy while remaining invisible himself, a tremendous tactical advantage that fundamentally changed the nature of submarine warfare. Japanese escort vessels, operating almost entirely without radar, had no equivalent capability. They relied on lookouts with binoculars, men straining their eyes to spot enemy submarines in the darkness. Against an enemy equipped with radar, this was hopelessly inadequate. The tactical implications of this technology gap were profound. American submarines could surface at night when Japanese lookouts were effectively blind and use their superior surface speed to maneuver into ideal attack positions. They could track entire convoys, plot the courses and speeds of multiple targets, and position themselves with mathematical precision to achieve the most effective shot. Once their torpedoes were in the water and heading toward their targets, the submarines could slip away, diving beneath the surface before Japanese escort vessels even realized they were under attack. By the time the torpedoes slammed into their targets and the night erupted in explosions, the attacking submarine was already gone, invisible in the dark water. Japanese lookouts would scan the ocean frantically, but they were searching for something they could not see, hunting an enemy who had already vanished. Japanese officers, still relying on the visual spotting techniques that had worked in earlier eras of naval warfare, found themselves bewildered and increasingly demoralized by the submarine attacks. They could not understand how the Americans always seemed to know exactly where the Japanese convoys were. The enemy attacked in fog when visibility was near zero. They attacked in rain when conditions made visual detection impossible. They attacked at night when no one should have been able to see anything at all. The Americans appeared to have no need for favorable conditions or good visibility. One destroyer captain, surviving an attack that had sunk 3 ships from the convoy he was escorting, filed a report expressing his complete frustration with the situation. "The enemy always knows where we are," he wrote. "He attacks when we cannot see. He does not need the sun or the moon or clear weather. He finds us regardless of conditions." For officers trained in traditional naval warfare, where visibility and weather played crucial roles in tactics, the American submarine threat seemed almost supernatural. The psychological toll of this campaign grew heavier with each passing month. Survivors of torpedoed convoys, men who had been pulled from burning oil slicks or who had clung to wreckage for hours before rescue, told stories that spread fear throughout the Japanese merchant marine. They described seeing ship after ship erupt in flames during a single night, sometimes 10 vessels lost in a few hours. They spoke of the terror of hearing explosions around them in the darkness, of not knowing where the next torpedo would strike, of the helplessness of being targeted by an enemy they could never see. These stories, passed from sailor to sailor, had a corrosive effect on morale. Merchant captains, civilian mariners who had been drafted into war service, began refusing to take their ships to sea. Some simply disappeared, abandoning their vessels rather than face another voyage. Crews deserted in droves, slipping away from their ships in port and disappearing into the population rather than risking another convoy run. By 1944, the situation had become so desperate that Japan's vital oil supply had been reduced to absurd and pitiful measures. So many tankers had been sunk, so much of the specialized tonnage needed to transport petroleum had been destroyed, that Japanese logistics officers resorted to shipping oil in 55-gallon drums. These drums were lashed together on open barges, vulnerable to weather and requiring huge amounts of manpower to handle. The system was phenomenally inefficient, reducing Japan's oil transport capacity to a fraction of what it had been early in the war. But even these makeshift efforts came under submarine attack. American submarine commanders, patrolling the sea lanes and searching for targets, filed patrol reports describing the sorry state of Japanese shipping. They found themselves targeting sampans, small traditional boats that in peacetime would have been used for fishing. They sank junks, simple wooden vessels carrying small amounts of coal or supplies. They even attacked wooden sailboats, vessels so primitive they seemed to belong to an earlier century rather than the modern era of mechanized warfare. Some American submarine captains reported that they hesitated before firing on such pathetic targets, feeling that the destruction of these small, helpless craft was somehow beneath the dignity of modern naval warfare. Yet each sinking, no matter how small the vessel, contributed to the larger strategic goal of strangling Japan's economy. Every fishing boat that failed to return meant less food for Japanese civilians. Every junk full of coal that went to the bottom meant less fuel for Japanese factories. Every sampan sunk was one less small link in the desperate supply chain that was trying to keep the empire functioning. The cumulative effect of thousands of these small losses was devastating. Within the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, senior admirals who had been trained to think in terms of battleship engagements and decisive fleet actions found themselves unable to grasp how such a small force of submarines was systematically dismantling their war machine. These officers had spent their entire careers preparing for grand tactical confrontations, studying the theories of naval theorists, planning for the day when the combined fleet would meet the American Pacific Fleet in battle and decide the war in a single apocalyptic engagement. They understood how to maneuver battle lines, how to coordinate carrier airstrikes, how to employ destroyers in torpedo attacks. What they did not understand, what their entire education and experience had not prepared them for, was a war of attrition against their merchant shipping. At staff meetings in Tokyo and at forward headquarters throughout the Pacific, reports arrived daily documenting more ships lost. The sheer volume of these reports became numbing. Each morning brought fresh lists of vessels that had failed to reach their destinations. The tanker Azusa Maru sunk with 10,000 tons of aviation fuel aboard, fuel that Japan's aircraft desperately needed and could not replace. The transport ship Lisbon Maru torpedoed while carrying 700 soldiers, with hundreds of men trapped below decks when the ship went down, a small but significant loss of trained manpower. The heavy cruiser Atago, serving as flagship for Admiral Kurita, one of Japan's most important naval commanders, destroyed in a matter of minutes by a submarine attack from the USS Data. The Atago's loss was particularly shocking because she was a major warship, powerfully armed and armoured, exactly the sort of vessel that was supposed to be relatively safe from submarine attack. Yet she had been found, targeted, and destroyed with brutal efficiency. By late 1944, the cumulative losses had reached a point where the Imperial Japanese Navy could barely function. The problem was not just the loss of ships, though that was catastrophic enough. The deeper problem was fuel. Japan's entire war machine ran on oil imported from the Dutch East Indies, from the wells of Borneo and Sumatra that Japan had seized in the first months of the war. That oil had to be transported thousands of miles to reach Japan's refineries, and the tanker fleet that carried it had been devastated by submarine attacks. The losses were so severe that major fleet units could not sail for lack of fuel. Destroyers sat in port with empty bunkers. Carriers remained anchored because there was no fuel for their aircraft. Even Japan's most prestigious warships, vessels that represented years of construction effort and enormous expenditures of resources, became useless metal hulks because they could not be fueled. The battleship Yamato stood as perhaps the most symbolic example of this fuel crisis. She was the largest battleship ever constructed, displacing more than 70,000 tons, mounting 9 18-inch guns, and armoured heavily enough to withstand hits from any weapon in any navy's arsenal. She and her sister ship Musashi represented the pinnacle of Japanese battleship design, the ultimate expression of the doctrine that had dominated Japanese naval thinking for decades. Yet Yamato spent most of her career tied up in harbour, too precious to risk and too fuel-hungry to deploy. When she finally did sortie for combat, it was only because the situation had become so desperate that the Navy was willing to sacrifice her. In April of 1945, Yamato was dispatched on what everyone understood was a suicide mission to Okinawa. The plan called for her to beach herself on the island's shore and use her massive guns as shore batteries until she was destroyed. The battleship was given only enough fuel for a one-way trip. There was no fuel allocation for a return voyage because the Navy's fuel situation had deteriorated to the point where such considerations were irrelevant. The mightiest battleship in the world sailed toward her death carrying just enough oil to reach the battlefield. Another factor in the American submarine's success that remains little known outside specialist circles was the enormous advantage provided by signals intelligence. American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese naval code designated JN-25 relatively early in the war. This code-breaking achievement meant that United States Navy intelligence could read Japanese naval communications with varying degrees of success throughout the conflict. The information gained from these decrypted messages was extraordinarily valuable to submarine operations. American commanders often knew convoy routes before the ships even left port. They knew departure times, destinations, the number and type of ships in the convoy, sometimes even the cargo being carried. This intelligence allowed American submarine commanders to position their boats with extraordinary precision. The submarine warfare tactics that emerged from this intelligence advantage resembled hunters setting up at watering holes rather than randomly searching for prey. Submarine skippers received information about where a convoy would be at a specific time, and they simply positioned their boats along that route and waited. When the Japanese ships appeared on schedule, often exactly where and when the intelligence predicted, the submarines attacked with devastating effect. Japanese officers, completely unaware that their codes had been compromised, could not understand why American submarines seemed to appear so frequently along their planned routes. Some suspected that there must be traitors within the Japanese merchant marine, informants who were passing ship movements to the enemy. Others blamed simple bad luck, an unfortunate series of coincidences. The truth was far worse than either of these explanations. Every radio message Japanese commanders sent, every signal they transmitted to coordinate their operations, was being read by their enemy. The Americans knew where Japanese ships would be because the Japanese themselves had told them, encrypted in a code they believed was secure, but which had in fact been broken. The shock and dismay that Japanese commanders felt extended beyond the merchant fleet to encompass major warships, vessels that were supposed to be the core of Japan's naval power. In 1944, the American submarine USS Albacore achieved one of the most significant kills of the entire submarine campaign when she torpedoed and sank the aircraft carrier Taiho. This carrier was Japan's newest and most advanced, incorporating all the lessons learned from earlier carrier designs and combat experience. She was large, well-armoured, and represented a huge investment of resources and industrial capacity. Yet a single American submarine found her, penetrated her defences, and put a torpedo into her hull. The damage from that single hit eventually led to catastrophic explosions as aviation fuel vapour ignited, and the Taiho went down with heavy loss of life. That same year, the submarine USS Kavala destroyed the carrier Shokaku, another major fleet carrier and a veteran of numerous battles dating back to Pearl Harbor. The loss of these two fleet carriers to submarine attack would have seemed impossible at the start of the war, when carriers were considered the dominant weapons of naval warfare, but by 1944 it had become an undeniable reality. Perhaps the most stunning submarine kill of the entire war came when the USS Archerfish sank the carrier Shinano. This vessel was extraordinary in every respect. Originally laid down as the third Yamato-class battleship, she had been converted during construction to an aircraft carrier in response to Japan's desperate need for carrier capacity after the losses at Midway. Shinano displaced 72,000 tons, making her the largest aircraft carrier ever built up to that time and the largest warship ever sunk by a submarine. The carrier had been commissioned only 10 days before her fatal voyage. She was being moved from the construction yard to another facility for final fitting out and had no air group aboard, no aircraft, no experienced crew, nothing that would make her an operational warship. She was basically a brand new empty carrier, making what should have been a safe coastal passage. The Archerfish found her anyway, tracked her through the night, manoeuvred into firing position, and launched a spread of torpedoes. Multiple hits flooded the carrier's hull, and despite damage control efforts, Shinano sank within hours of being hit. Japanese admirals, who had once considered aircraft carriers to be the centerpiece of their naval power, the weapons that would decide the war in the Pacific, realized with horror that none of their carriers were safe, not even the newest and largest, not even on short trips close to home waters. The industrial and logistical arithmetic behind the American submarine campaign was ruthlessly efficient in a way that overwhelmed Japanese attempts to respond. American submarines consumed enormous quantities of supplies during their operations. Each patrol required thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, dozens of torpedoes, spare parts for the myriad systems that kept the boats operational, food and supplies for crews spending weeks or months at sea. Yet the American supply system delivered everything that was needed with remarkable consistency. The United States had established a network of submarine bases that extended across the Pacific. Pearl Harbor in Hawaii served as the primary base for submarines operating in the Central Pacific. Fremantle in Australia became the base for boats working the waters around the Dutch East Indies and the South China Sea. As American forces advanced westward across the Pacific, capturing islands and establishing new bases, submarines gained forward operating locations at Guam and Saipan. These bases kept submarines operational on a continuous rotation. When one boat returned from patrol, another was ready to depart. Crews could rest and refit while other submarines maintained the pressure on Japanese shipping. This operational tempo, this ability to keep submarines constantly at sea and constantly hunting, was something Japan simply could not match with her anti-submarine forces. Japanese attempts to deploy anti-submarine escorts and defensive measures were pitiful compared to the scale of the threat. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not prioritized anti-submarine warfare before the war began, and it proved nearly impossible to develop effective countermeasures after the war had started. Japan had too few escort vessels, and the destroyers and smaller craft that were available had to be divided between protecting merchant convoys and screening fleet units. The escorts that were available often lacked effective sonar equipment, the underwater detection gear that was essential for finding and tracking submerged submarines. Japanese depth charges, the weapons used to attack submerged submarines, were less effective than their American or British equivalents. Japanese depth charge tactics were often poor, with escorts dropping charges randomly rather than in well-coordinated patterns designed to bracket the submarine's location. By 1944, the United States Navy had perfected its own version of Wolfpack tactics, the coordinated submarine operations that German U-boats had used so effectively in the Atlantic. 3 or more American submarines would coordinate their attacks on a single convoy, communicating with each other to set up simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. For Japanese convoys, these multi-submarine attacks were absolutely devastating. Ships under attack from multiple directions could not maneuver effectively to avoid all threats. Escorts attempting to counter one submarine found themselves unable to protect against others attacking from different bearings. The convoys often dissolved into complete chaos, with ships scattering in panic, turning in different directions, all formation discipline breaking down as each captain tried desperately to save his own vessel. But scattering only made the ships more vulnerable. Individual vessels fleeing from the convoy were picked off one by the waiting submarines. The ocean became littered with burning ships, survivors in the water, wreckage floating on the swells. For Japanese sailors serving aboard merchant ships or their escorts, the terror of submarine attack became a constant psychological burden. Convoys sailed with lookouts posted at every possible vantage point, men who strained their eyes, scanning every inch of the visible horizon, searching for the telltale wake of a torpedo or the brief glimpse of a periscope breaking the surface. Depth charges were dropped into empty water almost randomly. Explosive charges detonated more for the psychological reassurance they provided than because anyone seriously believed a submarine was present. The explosions from these charges, the columns of water they threw up, gave the crews some sense that they were fighting back, that they were not completely helpless. But the submarines continued to strike regardless. The attacks came at night, during storms, in fog, in supposedly safe waters close to shore, in areas where Japanese intelligence believed no American submarines were operating. The attacks came everywhere and anywhere, unpredictable and unstoppable. Survivors of torpedoed ships, men who had been blown into the water by explosions or who had abandoned their vessels as they sank, spent hours clinging to wreckage and floating debris, watching and waiting for rescue that might never come. These men often witnessed additional attacks even as they struggled to survive in the water. They saw the phosphorescent wakes of more torpedoes streaking through the darkness toward other ships in the convoy. They watched explosions tear apart the vessels that might have rescued them. The psychological trauma of these experiences was profound. Survivors wrote in diaries and letters of recurring nightmares about steel fish lurking in the depths below them, invisible predators waiting to strike, weapons against which there was no defense and no escape. The mental image of torpedoes rising up from the darkness beneath the waves haunted these men long after their rescue. Senior Japanese naval officers eventually came to understand the full magnitude of what was happening to their nation's war effort, though this understanding came far too late to change the outcome. Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, speaking after the war had ended, made a statement that captured the essence of Japan's defeat at the hands of American submarines. "We had no answer," Fukudomi admitted. "Our navy was defeated not in the decisive battle we had prepared for, not in grand fleet engagements between capital ships, but in silence beneath the waves. The war we trained for, the war we expected to fight, never came. Instead, we were strangled slowly, month by month, as our shipping was destroyed by an enemy we could not see and could not effectively fight. This was not the kind of defeat that could be explained by tactical errors or inferior fighting spirit. This was a systemic failure, a fundamental misunderstanding of how the war would actually be fought. The impact of the submarine campaign extended far beyond military considerations. Even civilian Japan, the home islands themselves, felt the effects directly and profoundly by 1945. Food shortages became severe as rice imports from Southeast Asia were cut off. The rice rations that civilians depended on shrank month by month, from full portions to half portions to barely enough to sustain life. Factories shut down because coal shipments ceased. Cities that had relied on imported coal for heat and power found themselves freezing during the winter months. Electricity became unreliable, available only for a few hours each day. Hospitals ran out of imported medicines, leaving doctors unable to treat diseases that should have been easily curable. Mothers in Japan's cities fed their children millet or acorns, foods that in normal times would have been considered animal feed, because rice was simply not available. Malnutrition became widespread. Children showed the signs of vitamin deficiencies and stunted growth. The entire civilian population of Japan was suffering the consequences of the severed sea lanes. Whole regions of Japan's empire found themselves completely cut off from the home islands. Manchuria, the puppet state in northeastern China that Japan had controlled since the 1930s, could no longer ship resources back to Japan. The Philippines, captured at great cost in the early months of the war, became isolated. The Dutch East Indies, the source of oil that Japan's entire war machine depended upon, might as well have been on another planet for all the good it did Japan. The oil wells were still pumping, the rubber plantations were still producing, the rice fields were still yielding crops, but none of those resources could reach Japan because the ships that should have carried them were at the bottom of the ocean. The Japanese High Command, still obsessed with the idea of a decisive naval battle that would turn the tide of the war, had ignored the fundamental importance of logistics. They had failed to protect the lifelines that their empire depended upon. American submarines had severed those lifelines methodically, systematically, link by link, until the entire structure collapsed. One final statistic reveals the true magnitude of what American submarines accomplished during the Pacific War. Japan began the war with approximately 6,200 merchant ships of all types and sizes. American submarines sank more than half of them, over 3,000 vessels sent to the bottom. Of 350 major Japanese warships, submarines sank 201, well over half. These numbers represent one of the most successful naval campaigns in history, a campaign that receives far less attention than the great carrier battles or amphibious invasions, but which arguably did more to defeat Japan than any other single aspect of the war at sea. The cost to achieve this success was high. 52 American submarines were lost during the war, destroyed by depth charges, mines, surface attacks, or simply disappeared without trace. 3,500 American submariners were killed, giving the submarine service one of the highest casualty rates of any branch of the United States military. But the exchange ratio was so favorable that it crippled Japan beyond any possibility of recovery. By the year 1945, as the war approached its conclusion, Japanese admirals who had once mocked American submarines and dismissed them as irrelevant were desperately begging for countermeasures that they did not possess and could not develop. They needed more destroyers for convoy escort, but destroyers required steel and skilled labor and time to build, none of which Japan had in sufficient quantities. They needed better sonar equipment, but Japan's electronics industry could not produce it in meaningful numbers. They needed radar to match what the Americans had, but Japanese radar technology had fallen years behind. They needed aircraft for aerial anti-submarine patrols, but aircraft required fuel that Japan no longer had. The ocean that had once been Japan's highway of empire, the maritime domain that Japanese strategists had assumed would be theirs to control, had become a graveyard. More than 5,000 Japanese merchant ships lay on the ocean floor. Tens of thousands of Japanese sailors had drowned or been killed in the attacks. Millions of tons of irreplaceable cargo had been lost. When the surrender finally came in August of 1945, after atomic bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the Soviet Union had entered the war against Japan, after the situation had become completely hopeless, many Japanese naval officers confessed that their greatest shock had not been the atomic bombs, as terrible as those weapons were. It was not the carrier air raids that had burned Japan's cities. It was not the massive invasion fleet being assembled for the assault on the home islands. The greatest shock, the thing that haunted these officers and that they discussed among themselves after the war, was the submarines. They had fought bravely by their own standards, had sacrificed willingly, had accepted death in defense of their nation. But none of that mattered because they had starved. The submarines had been the truly unseen enemy, the weapon that destroyed Japan's capacity to wage war without most Japanese people even understanding what was happening. The submarines had won through patient attrition, through the unglamorous work of blockade, through the systematic destruction of logistics networks that no one paid attention to until they ceased to exist. Admiral Suemu Toyoda, who served as chief of the Naval General Staff, summarized the situation in words that cut to the heart of Japan's defeat. "We fought as bravely as any military force in history," he said. "Our sailors and soldiers were willing to die, and millions of them did. But courage could not overcome the fact that we starved. Our factories had no raw materials. Our ships had no fuel. Our people had no food. The American submarines destroyed our ability to wage war by cutting the supply lines we had failed to adequately protect. They did not need to defeat us in battle. They simply needed to wait while we slowly suffocated." For Admiral Matsunaga, standing on the bridge of the Ioba on that night in September of 1944, the attack he witnessed became something he would never forget for the rest of his life. His flagship managed to survive the attack, maneuvering frantically to avoid the torpedo that had been aimed at her, limping back to port with the remnants of his shattered task force. But half of the ships in his convoy never made it to Manila. They were gone, sunk in the dark waters of the South China Sea, their crews dead or struggling in the water, their cargoes lost forever. Several days later, when Matsunaga walked along the pier in Manila Harbour, he could still see oil burning on the water, spreading in iridescent slicks that stretched for miles. The oil came from sunken tankers, their precious cargo leaking from ruptured hulls deep below the surface, rising to the surface to burn uselessly on the waves. Standing there, watching the waste and destruction, Matsunaga spoke quietly to one of his surviving staff officers. "The Americans are not in one place," he said. "They are not concentrated where we expect them. They are everywhere." His voice carried a tone of defeated resignation that the officer had never heard from his admiral before. Matsunaga was right. The American submarine force, numbering fewer than 300 boats at any given time, spread across an ocean spanning thousands of miles, had made the Pacific into an inescapable cage for the Empire of Japan. The submarines strangled that empire from beneath the waves, cutting off resources, destroying shipping, isolating territories, starving the population, and crippling the military. There was no escape from the steel fish that hunted in the darkness. There was no way to protect the thousands of ships that moved across the ocean carrying the materials that Japan needed to survive. The ocean that had seemed so vast, so impossible to control, had been turned into a hunting ground where every voyage was potentially fatal and where the predators held every advantage. Japan's merchant marine died ship by ship, sailor by sailor, voyage by voyage, until there was almost nothing left. The empire that had sought to dominate the Pacific perished not in glorious battle, but through slow strangulation, cut off from the resources it needed, unable to move goods or troops or fuel across waters that had become far too dangerous. This was how Japan lost the Pacific War, beneath the silent, patient, deadly patrols of submarines that were everywhere and nowhere, invisible until the moment they struck, unstoppable even when detected, the weapon that Japan had dismissed and that ultimately destroyed her.